On the windswept Nebraska plains of 1886, where hope came as scarce as rainfall, Clara Whitlow arrived in Milfield with nothing but determination and a dream growing larger than the child in her belly. This young widow didn't come seeking charity or sympathy. She came with a box of weathered books and an unwavering belief that every child deserved an education, no matter how poor their family or humble their circumstances. While town fathers dismissed her as a foolish woman chasing impossible dreams, Clara rolled up her sleeves and began transforming an abandoned barn into a schoolhouse. One by one, children appeared at her makeshift door, barefoot farm boys, orphaned girls, the forgotten and overlooked. They came because Clara saw potential where others saw only burden. Then Barrett Holt, the territory's most successful cattleman, rode past her little school one evening. What he witnessed would change everything he thought he knew about strength, purpose, and love. But would a wealthy cowboy's vision align with a pregnant teacher's mission? The morning Clara Whitlow first set foot in Milfield, Nebraska, the wind carried the scent of dust and distant rain that never seemed to arrive. She stepped down from the creaking wagon that had brought her the final 30 miles from the railroad terminus, her hand instinctively protecting the gentle swell beneath her worn calico dress. The driver, a weathered man named Jeremiah who'd spoken perhaps 20 words during their 2-day journey, hefted her wooden trunk and the precious box of books to the ground with surprising gentleness. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes taking in the collection of weathered buildings that comprised Milfield's main street. "Ain't much here for a lady in your particular circumstances." Clara's fingers tightened around the brass key her late husband Thomas had pressed into her palm 3 months before consumption finally claimed him. The key to possibilities, he'd called it, though she knew it was simply the key to his uncle's abandoned property on the edge of this struggling prairie town. Thomas had spoken of Nebraska with the fervor of a man who'd never seen its harsh realities, endless sky that could feel like freedom or imprisonment depending on your frame of mind, winters that bit deep into both land and spirit, summers that baked hope right out of the soil. "There's always more than meets the eye, Mr. Jeremiah," Clara replied, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through Thomas's long illness and the difficult journey west. "Sometimes the most barren ground holds the greatest promise." The driver nodded slowly, accepting payment with calloused hands. As his wagon disappeared down the rutted road, Clara stood alone in the middle of what would either become her new beginning or her final mistake. The main street stretched before her like a question mark. The general store with its faded sign, a blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil provided the town's heartbeat, a small church whose white paint had surrendered to the relentless prairie sun, and Murphy's saloon, from which emerged the low murmur of men's voices and the occasional burst of rough laughter. She lifted her box of books, 37 volumes that represented everything she knew about nurturing young minds, and began walking toward the edge of town where Thomas's inheritance waited. The books had belonged to her father, a circuit preacher who'd believed that education was the Lord's work in its purest form. Mathematics primers, readers filled with moral tales, a worn copy of McGuffey's Eclectic Readers, geography books that could transport prairie children to distant lands, and a precious volume of Shakespeare that had cost her father a month's salary, but which he'd declared worth every penny for the beauty it could plant in young souls. The barn stood at the intersection of optimism and reality. Thomas had written of it as a substantial structure with good bones, but Clara could see that time and Nebraska weather had been harsh judges. The roof sagged in places where shingles had given way to wind and hail. The wide doors hung askew on hinges that rust had conquered. Yet something in the building's stance spoke to her. The way it had weathered decades of storms and still stood, stubborn and determined, much like Clara herself. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards. The floor, though uneven, was solid. The space was generous enough for 20 children, perhaps 30 if they didn't mind close quarters. Clara set down her box of books and walked the perimeter, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She could envision rough-hewn desks arranged in rows, a simple blackboard mounted on the eastern wall where morning light would illuminate lessons, shelves built to hold the books that would serve as windows to wider worlds. "Lord have mercy," came a voice from the doorway. Clara turned to see a woman perhaps her own age, dressed in practical brown wool with graying hair pulled severely back. "You must be the widow Jenkins wrote about." "Clara Whitlow," she replied, extending her hand. "And you are?" "Martha Crenshaw. My husband runs the general store." Martha's eyes took in Clara's condition with the frank assessment of a woman who'd birthed 6 children of her own. "Heard tell you're planning to start some sort of school in this old place." "That's correct. I was a teacher back in Ohio before I married. I believe the children here deserve the same opportunities as children anywhere." Martha's laugh held little humor. "Children here got opportunities aplenty, Mrs. Whitlow. Opportunity to help with harvest, opportunity to tend livestock, opportunity to learn the kind of practical skills that keep families alive on the frontier. What they don't need is fancy book learning that'll just make them dissatisfied with honest work." Clara had heard similar sentiments throughout her journey west, but they still rankled. "Reading and arithmetic aren't fancy, Mrs. Crenshaw. They're necessities. A farmer who can't calculate his costs or read market reports is at the mercy of every unscrupulous buyer who comes along. A woman who can't read may never know if the medicine she's giving her child is poison or cure." "Pretty words," Martha conceded, "but words don't plant crops or birth calves, and they surely don't put food on tables when winter comes hard." Her gaze softened slightly. "You seem like a decent sort, Mrs. Whitlow, but you're carrying more burden than any woman should bear alone. Perhaps you ought to consider more practical employment. Mrs. Henderson at the hotel could use help with laundry, and the pay's steady." After Martha left, Clara stood alone in the barn again, but this time she wasn't seeing the decay and neglect. She was seeing possibility. The first step would be making the space weatherproof. Thomas had left her a small inheritance, enough to purchase basic supplies if she was careful. She'd written letters of inquiry to potential students during her journey, addressing them to the parents of Milfield and posting them from every stop. If even a handful of families responded positively, she could justify the investment. That evening, in the small room she'd rented above Murphy's saloon, the only lodging available in town, Clara spread her father's books on the narrow bed and began planning lessons. The sounds from below were loud and sometimes crude, but she'd learned to block out distractions during Thomas's illness, when neighbors gathered to comfort with whiskey and well-meaning but unhelpful advice. She was writing sample arithmetic problems when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats and the jingle of spurs in the street below. Through her window she caught sight of a man on horseback, tall in the saddle, wearing a black hat and coat that spoke of prosperity. He reined in his horse directly beneath her window, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Even in the lamplight she could see he was handsome in the weathered way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with eyes that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. Barrett Holt, she'd been told by the hotel proprietor, owned more cattle than any man in 3 counties and had a reputation for being fair but firm in his dealings. A widower like herself, though his loss was older and he'd seemingly made peace with solitude. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before disappearing into Murphy's saloon, leaving Clara with the strange sensation that their brief encounter had been somehow significant, though she couldn't say why. 3 days later, she received her first response to the letters, a note written in careful script by someone who'd clearly labored over each word. "Mrs. Whitlow, we heard about your school plan. Our boy Jimmy is 8 and smart as a whip, but we never learned letters ourselves, so can't teach him proper. If you're serious about taking farm children, we'd be obliged. We can pay some in vegetables and eggs if that's acceptable. Respectfully, Samuel and Mary Rodriguez." Clara pressed the letter to her chest, feeling tears she hadn't expected. One family, one boy, it was enough to begin. The next morning she walked to the barn with renewed purpose, her box of books tucked securely under her arm. The abandoned structure no longer looked like a relic of failed dreams. It looked like the foundation for something remarkable. As she pushed open the protesting doors and stepped into the dusty interior, Clara Whitlow began the work that would transform not just her own life but the lives of everyone in Milfield. She didn't notice the rider who paused on the hill overlooking the barn, watching her with curious intensity before spurring his horse toward town. Barrett Holt had ridden past the old Whitlow barn 3 times in the past week, though he'd have been hard-pressed to explain why. His usual route to check the southern pastures took him nowhere near the dilapidated structure, yet something kept drawing him back to the ridge that overlooked the property. Perhaps it was curiosity about the woman who'd stirred up more conversation in Milfield than a traveling preacher or a cattle buyer with deep pockets. From his vantage point, he could see her working inside the barn each morning, a small figure moving with determined purpose among the shadows and dust. She'd somehow acquired lumber, probably from Henderson's mill, though Barrett wondered how she'd managed the expense on a widow's budget. The sound of hammering drifted across the prairie on still afternoons, a steady rhythm that spoke of patience and persistence. Tonight was different. As the sun settled toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Barrett saw something that made him rein in his horse and lean forward in the saddle. Light flickered through the gaps in the barn walls, not the harsh glare of kerosene lamps, but the warm golden glow of candles or lanterns turned low. He urged his horse closer, staying in the shadows of a cottonwood grove that bordered the property. What he witnessed through a gap in the barn's weathered boards stopped him cold. Clara Whitlow sat on a wooden crate in the center of the barn, her back straight despite the obvious weight of her pregnancy. Around her, arranged in a rough semicircle on makeshift benches and upturned boxes, sat nearly a dozen children. Their faces, illuminated by the soft lantern light, were turned toward her with the rapt attention Barrett had seen on congregants during particularly moving sermons. She was reading to them, not from a primer or lesson book, but from what appeared to be a volume of stories. Her voice carried clearly in the still evening air, rich with expression as she brought characters to life. A boy of perhaps 10 sat cross-legged on the floor, chin resting in his hands, completely absorbed. Twin girls who couldn't have been more than 6 shared a wooden stool, leaning against each other as they listened. An older boy, Barrett recognized him as one of the Rodriguez children, mended a harness while his ears tracked every word. But it was Clara herself who captured Barrett's attention. He'd seen her in town, of course, conducting business with quiet dignity, but here in her element she seemed transformed. Her face glowed with more than lamplight, animated by joy in her work and love for these children who'd come to her makeshift school despite their parents' skepticism. As if sensing his presence, she looked up mid-sentence. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the distance, and Barrett felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition he hadn't experienced since his wife Sarah had died 3 years ago. Clara didn't falter in her reading, but a slight smile touched her lips before she returned her attention to the story. Barrett remained in the shadows until the last child departed, watching Clara carefully extinguish the lanterns and secure the barn for the night. Only when she disappeared down the path toward town did he emerge from his hiding place, but he didn't ride away. Instead, he dismounted and walked to the barn, peering through the gaps that had given him his unexpected view of her work. The interior still held the warmth of human presence. He could make out the rough desks she'd constructed, the slateboard mounted on the wall, the careful arrangement of books on shelves fashioned from mill ends and determination. It was humble, certainly, but there was something about the space that spoke of dreams taking root in unlikely soil. The sound of approaching thunder made Barrett look toward the western sky. What he saw there sent him hurrying back to his horse. The storm building on the horizon was the kind that prairie dwellers learned to respect, a towering wall of black clouds shot through with veins of lightning, advancing with the inexorable power of nature unleashed. He'd barely reached his ranch house when the first drops fell, fat and heavy with the promise of deluge. Within minutes, rain was sheeting across the prairie in wind-driven torrents, and Barrett found himself wondering if Clara's patched barn roof would hold against the assault. The storm raged through the night with the fury that only Nebraska weather could summon. Barrett lay awake, listening to rain hammer against his windows and wind howl around the solid walls of his home. More than once he found himself thinking of a pregnant woman in a rented room above Murphy's saloon, wondering if she too was lying awake and worrying about her fragile dream. Dawn brought an end to the storm, but not to Barrett's unease. He saddled his horse before full daylight and rode toward the barn, though he told himself it was merely to check for damage to the fence line that bordered the property. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The barn's roof had partially collapsed under the weight of rain and wind, leaving a gaping hole that exposed the interior to the elements. Water stood in puddles on the floor, and Barrett could see that Clara's carefully arranged books and supplies had been soaked. The slateboard lay in pieces, shattered by a falling beam, but it was the sight of Clara herself that struck him most forcefully. She stood in the center of the destruction, her skirts muddy and her face streaked with what might have been rain or tears. In her arms she cradled a wooden box, the same box he'd seen her carry from the wagon on the day of her arrival. Her most precious books, he realized, the ones she'd managed to save from the deluge. Mrs. Whitlow. He dismounted and approached carefully, removing his hat. "I came to check on the damage from the storm." She looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of despair and determination. "Mr. Holt, as you can see, the storm has rather effectively ended my teaching experiment. This barn, you mean, but not your school." The certainty in his own voice surprised him, but as soon as the words left his mouth, Barrett knew they were true. He'd spent 3 years since Sarah's death focused solely on building his cattle empire, avoiding emotional entanglements, telling himself that success in business was sufficient purpose for any man. But watching Clara's face crumple as she surveyed the destruction of her dreams, he felt something wake up inside him that had been dormant since his wife's funeral. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Clara said quietly. "This building can be repaired, better than before. A proper roof, weatherproof walls, real windows that let in light without letting in rain." Barrett surprised himself with the specificity of his vision. "I could have a crew here within the week." Clara's chin lifted with the pride he was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Mr. Holt, I appreciate your kindness, but I cannot accept charity. I came here to build something with my own hands and resources. Not charity, partnership." The word emerged from somewhere deeper than Barrett's conscious mind, but as soon as he spoke it, he knew it was right. "You have something I lack, Mrs. Whitlow. Purpose beyond profit, and I have resources you need. Seems to me we might help each other." The silence stretched between them, while Clara studied his face as if trying to read his true intentions. Barrett found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't have said why her answer mattered so much. "What would you expect in return?" she asked finally. Barrett looked around the damaged barn, thinking of the children he'd seen the night before, their eager faces in the lamplight, the way they'd hung on Clara's every word. "To learn something I've forgotten," he said honestly. "What it feels like to build something that matters more than money." Clara shifted the box of books in her arms, and Barrett glimpsed the silver glint of his father's pocket watch in his vest. The timepiece had marked every important moment of his adult life: his wedding to Sarah, the birth and loss of their only child, Sarah's final breath. Time, he'd learned, was the most precious commodity of all, and here was a woman willing to spend hers on other people's children, with no guarantee of reward. "I would have conditions," Clara said slowly. "Name them. This would be a true school, Mr. Holt, not a place to warehouse children while adults conduct business. We would teach reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, everything these children need to make their own choices about their futures." Agreed. "And every child would be welcome, regardless of their family's ability to pay or their station in life." Barrett thought of his own childhood, the son of a poor farmer who'd never learned to read beyond his own name, especially those children, Mrs. Whitlow. For the first time since he'd found her in the ruins of her dream, Clara smiled. It was a tentative expression, but it transformed her face completely, and Barrett felt his heart perform a maneuver he'd thought it had forgotten. "In that case, Mr. Holt, I believe we have an understanding." She extended her free hand, and when Barrett took it, he was struck by the strength in her grip. This was a woman who would hold up her end of any bargain. "There's just one more thing," he said, reluctant to release her hand. "Call me Barrett. If we're to be partners, we should probably dispense with formalities." "Clara," she replied, and Barrett thought he'd never heard his name spoken with quite that combination of gratitude and hope. As they stood together in the wreckage, water still dripping from the broken roof, Barrett Holt made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. He was going to help Clara Whitlow build her school, and somewhere in the process, he suspected she might help him rebuild something in himself that he'd thought was lost forever. The sound of approaching voices made them both turn toward the road. A small group of people was walking toward the barn. Parents, Barrett realized, come to see what the storm had done to their children's school. At the front of the group walked the Rodriguez family, their faces etched with concern. "Mrs. Whitlow," called Samuel Rodriguez, "we saw the roof from the road. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Mr. Rodriguez," Clara called back, her voice carrying clearly across the muddy ground. "A bit wet, but unharmed." As the group drew closer, Barrett saw uncertainty in their faces. These were practical people who'd learned not to trust in anything that seemed too good to last. The destruction of the barn would only confirm their suspicions that book learning was a luxury their children couldn't afford. But Clara stepped forward to meet them, her chin raised and her voice steady. "I know this looks discouraging," she said, gesturing to the damaged building. "But sometimes the strongest foundations are laid in the most difficult circumstances. Mr. Holt has offered to help us rebuild, and I believe we can create something even better than what we had before." Barrett watched the faces in the group, seeing the moment when skepticism began to give way to cautious hope. These people had invested their trust in Clara's dream, and she wasn't about to let a storm or anything else destroy what they'd begun to build together. The sound of Barrett's hammer rang across the prairie with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to honest work. Clara watched from her position, sorting water-damaged books, marveling at how naturally he moved between directing his hired crew and taking up tools himself. She'd expected a wealthy cattleman to supervise from a distance, but Barrett worked alongside his men with the easy competence of someone who'd built his fortune through his own labor. "Hand me that brace, Miguel," Barrett called to one of his workers, a young man whose family had recently settled in the area. The respect in Miguel's response told Clara volumes about Barrett's character. Men who'd worked for him spoke of him with genuine regard, not the grudging deference that wealth sometimes commanded. It had been 4 days since the storm, and already the barn showed signs of transformation. Barrett's crew had cleared the debris, reinforced the foundation, and begun framing a new roof that would be both stronger and higher than the original. True to his word, Barrett was building not just a repaired barn, but a proper schoolhouse. "Mrs. Whitlow," came a voice from behind her. Clara turned to see Dr. Henley approaching, his medical bag in hand and concern written across his weathered features. Ezra Henley had been Milfield's only doctor for 15 years, serving a territory that stretched 40 miles in every direction. He was a man of few words but deep compassion, and Clara had grown to appreciate his direct manner during her brief time in town. "Dr. Henley, have you come to check on our progress?" "Come to check on you," he replied bluntly. "Storm like that's enough to unsettle anyone, but a woman in your condition needs to be particularly careful about strain and worry." Clara set down the book she'd been examining, a geography text that had survived the deluge with only minor water damage. "I assure you I'm quite well, perhaps a bit tired, but that's to be expected." Dr. Henley's keen eyes took in her pale complexion and the way she'd been favoring her lower back as she worked. "When's the last time you had a proper meal? And I don't mean whatever scraps Murphy's been passing off as food at the saloon." Before Clara could respond, Barrett appeared at her elbow, having apparently overheard the doctor's question. "Mrs. Whitlow has been taking her meals at my ranch house," he said smoothly. "Mrs. Garcia prepares enough food to feed a small army, and she insisted on Clara's company." Clara blinked in surprise. Barrett had made no such invitation, though his housekeeper had indeed stopped by the barn yesterday with a basket of warm tortillas and savory stew that had been the best meal Clara had enjoyed since leaving Ohio. "Is that so?" Dr. Henley looked between them with the shrewd expression of a man who'd delivered more babies and seen more of human nature than most. "Well, that's sensible. Woman needs proper nutrition, especially now." He paused, studying Clara's face. "You been sleeping? As well as can be expected above Murphy's establishment," Clara replied diplomatically. Dr. Henley glanced at Barrett, and some silent communication passed between the two men. "Might be time to consider more suitable lodging. Town's growing, and respectable accommodations are becoming available." After the doctor departed, Clara found herself alone with Barrett, while his crew took their midday break. The awkwardness she'd expected to feel in his presence hadn't materialized. Instead, she found Barrett surprisingly easy to talk to, a good listener who asked thoughtful questions and offered practical suggestions without condescension. "You didn't need to tell Dr. Henley about meals at your ranch," Clara said, as they walked through the framed structure that would soon become her classroom. "Mrs. Garcia genuinely did invite you. I was simply facilitating the arrangement." Barrett paused near what would become the front wall, his hand resting on a beam he'd shaped himself. "She's been after me for months to bring someone to dinner. Says I'm becoming too solitary for my own good. And what do you think?" Barrett was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where his cattle grazed in peaceful contentment. "I think a man can convince himself that solitude and self-sufficiency are the same thing. But watching you work with those children the other night, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "How much richer life becomes when you're part of something larger than yourself." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the sincerity in his voice. She busied herself examining the window frame Barrett's men had installed that morning, admiring the craftsmanship that would ensure proper light for reading without drafts that might chill her students in winter. "Speaking of the children," she said, "I received another letter this morning. The Kowalski family wants to enroll their 3 youngest. That brings our total to 15 students." 15? Barrett smiled, and Clara noticed how the expression softened the austere lines of his face. "That's more than most established schools in larger towns." "It's a beginning." Clara ran her hand along the smooth wood of the windowsill. "Though I confess, I'm somewhat nervous about managing so many students with such varied ages and abilities." "You'll adapt. Good teachers always do." Barrett's confidence in her abilities sent a warm glow through Clara's chest. "My mother taught in a one-room schoolhouse back in Kansas before she married my father. She used to say that teaching multiple ages together was actually advantageous. The older children helped the younger ones, and everyone learned at their own pace." It was the first time Barrett had shared anything personal about his family, and Clara found herself hungry for more details about the experiences that had shaped him. "Does your mother still teach?" "She died when I was 16. Typhoid fever." Barrett's voice remained steady, but Clara caught the flash of old pain in his eyes. "She would have liked what you're doing here, though. She believed education was the great equalizer."
Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming hard across the prairie, dust trailing behind his horse. As he drew closer, Clara recognized Tom Brennan, who worked for Barrett's neighbor to the east. "Mr. Holt," Tom called as he reined in his lathered horse. "Mr. Carlyle sent me to fetch you. We got trouble with rustlers hitting the north pasture. Took maybe 30 head last night." Barrett's expression immediately shifted to business mode. "How many riders?" "Tracks suggest 4, maybe 5. They drove the cattle toward the river crossing. I'll gather my men and meet Carlyle at the crossing within the hour." Barrett turned to Clara, clearly torn between his obligations. "I'm sorry to leave you with the work unfinished." "Nonsense. Protecting your livelihood takes precedence over my school repairs." Clara was surprised by the concern she felt for his safety. Rustlers were often desperate men who wouldn't hesitate to shoot anyone who interfered with their plans. "The crew can continue working on the roof framing," Barrett said, already moving toward his horse. "Miguel knows what needs to be done." As Barrett swung into his saddle, Clara stepped forward impulsively. "Be careful," she said, then immediately felt foolish for the maternal tone that had crept into her voice. Barrett's eyes met hers, and for a moment the urgency of the situation seemed to fade. "I will," he promised. Then, with a touch of his hat brim, he spurred his horse toward town to gather his men. Clara watched until he disappeared over the hill, then returned to her work with the books. But she found it difficult to concentrate, her ears tuned for the sound of gunshots that might carry across the prairie on the afternoon wind. Miguel and the other workers continued their tasks with practiced efficiency, but Clara noticed they too seemed distracted, glancing frequently toward the horizon. These men understood the dangers their employer faced better than she did. It was nearly sunset when Barrett returned, his clothes dusty and his face grim but uninjured. Relief flooded through Clara as she watched him dismount and speak quietly with his crew before approaching her. "Did you catch them?" she asked. "2 of them. The others escaped across the river, but they left most of the cattle behind." Barrett removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. "It's becoming a serious problem in this territory. Organized gangs working their way north from Texas. You look exhausted. Perhaps you should rest." Barrett's smile was tired but genuine. "Mrs. Garcia will have dinner ready soon. You mentioned accepting her invitation." Clara hesitated. Dining at Barrett's ranch house seemed like a significant step, though she couldn't quite articulate why. But the prospect of a home-cooked meal and conversation with people who didn't view her with suspicion was too appealing to refuse. "I would be honored," she said.
As they rode toward Barrett's ranch house, Clara seated sideways on a gentle mare Barrett had saddled for her. She marveled at how natural it felt to be beside him. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, broken only by Barrett's occasional comments about landmarks or wildlife they passed. The ranch house itself was larger than Clara had expected, built of good timber with a wide porch that suggested evenings spent watching sunsets over the prairie. Mrs. Garcia, a motherly woman whose English was accented but clear, welcomed Clara with warmth that felt genuine rather than polite. Over dinner, roasted chicken with vegetables from Mrs. Garcia's garden and bread that was still warm from the oven, Clara found herself relaxing completely for the first time since arriving in Milfield. Barrett proved to be an engaging conversationalist, asking thoughtful questions about her teaching methods and sharing stories of his own childhood that revealed both humor and hard-earned wisdom. When Mrs. Garcia brought out a hand-carved wooden bell for Clara to examine, Barrett's explanation brought tears to her eyes. He'd commissioned it from a local craftsman to hang in the schoolhouse tower he was planning to add to the building. "Every proper school needs a bell to call its students," he said simply, but Clara heard the deeper message in his words. This wasn't just about repairing storm damage. Barrett was committed to helping her build something lasting. As the evening wound down and Barrett prepared to escort her back to town, Clara felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. For the first time since arriving in Nebraska, she wasn't facing her challenges alone. She had a partner, someone who believed in her vision and possessed the resources to help make it reality. But as they rode through the gathering darkness, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their partnership was evolving into something more complex and precious than either of them had initially intended. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, because she was beginning to understand that losing Barrett's support would mean losing far more than just help with her school. Clara turned her late husband's wedding ring over in her palm, watching the thin gold band catch the morning light streaming through her small window above Murphy's saloon. The ring had grown loose during her pregnancy, sliding easily off her finger now, though she'd worn it faithfully for 3 years of marriage and 4 months of widowhood. Thomas had saved for 6 months to buy it from a jeweler in Cincinnati, presenting it to her with shy pride on their wedding day. But sentiment wouldn't purchase the slate boards her students needed, or the primers that would teach them to read beyond the simple words they already knew. Clara had made careful calculations in her ledger book, adding and subtracting the same figures until the reality became inescapable. Even with Barrett's generous help rebuilding the schoolhouse, she lacked funds for basic supplies. The ring would bring perhaps $15 at Henderson's general store, enough for essential materials to start the school year properly. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned her interest in the piece when Clara had inquired about prices, noting that good jewelry was scarce on the frontier and commanded premium prices from women hungry for small luxuries. A knock at her door interrupted Clara's contemplation. She slipped the ring into her pocket and opened the door to find Barrett standing in the narrow hallway, his hat in his hands and concern etched across his features. "I apologize for the early hour," he said, "but I wanted to speak with you before heading out to the south pasture. May I come in?" Clara hesitated. Allowing a man into her private quarters would certainly provide fodder for the gossips who already whispered about their partnership, but Barrett's expression suggested important business. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter the cramped space that served as her temporary home. Barrett's presence seemed to fill the small room, making Clara acutely aware of its shabby furnishings and the intimate setting. He remained standing near the door, clearly conscious of the impropriety but apparently considering their business urgent enough to risk it. "I've been thinking about funding for school supplies," he began without preamble. "I know you've been concerned about expenses, and I have a proposal." Clara's hand instinctively moved to her pocket where the wedding ring lay hidden. "What sort of proposal?" "A loan. Interest-free, to be repaid when the school becomes self-sustaining through tuition fees." Barrett's voice was carefully neutral, businesslike. "I could advance you $50 immediately, more if needed later." The offer was generous beyond anything Clara had dared hope, but it stirred the same pride that had made her initially refuse Barrett's help with the building repairs. "Mr. Holt," Barrett, "I appreciate your offer, but I cannot accept such a large sum without clear terms for repayment." "The terms are simple. When parents begin paying tuition." "If parents begin paying tuition," Clara corrected. "Many of these families have little cash money. They may only be able to pay in goods or labor." Barrett was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made Clara's cheeks warm. "You're planning to sell something," he said finally. It wasn't a question. Clara considered denying it, but Barrett's perceptive gaze made deception seem pointless. "I have some jewelry that should fetch enough for basic supplies." "Your wedding ring." Again, not a question. Clara's hand moved involuntarily to her pocket, confirming what Barrett had already deduced. "It's a practical solution," she said, lifting her chin defensively. "The ring serves no purpose beyond sentiment, and sentiment doesn't teach children to read." Barrett moved closer, close enough that Clara could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Some things are worth more than their practical value," he said quietly. "That ring represents your marriage, your husband's love. Once it's gone, you can never get it back." "Thomas is gone," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I carry his memory in my heart, not on my finger. He would understand. He believed in education as deeply as I do. I'm sure he would understand, but that doesn't mean it's the right choice." Barrett paused, seeming to wrestle with himself before continuing. "Accept the loan, Clara. Not as charity, but as an investment in something we both believe in. When the school succeeds, and it will succeed, you can repay me." The certainty in his voice moved Clara more than the offer itself. Barrett truly believed in her vision, believed in her ability to make it reality. The knowledge was both humbling and empowering. "What if I fail?" she asked. "What if the community decides they don't want or need the school? What if my child arrives early and I'm unable to teach?" Barrett's expression softened. "Then we'll face those challenges when they come. But failure isn't determined by obstacles, Clara. It's determined by whether you stop trying." Before Clara could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs announced another visitor. Barrett immediately stepped back, creating proper distance between them as a sharp knock sounded on the door. Clara opened it to find Martha Crenshaw standing in the hallway, her face flushed with either exertion from the stairs or excitement about whatever news had brought her. "Mrs. Whitlow." Martha stopped abruptly as she noticed Barrett's presence. Her eyes darted between them, taking in the intimate setting and drawing obvious conclusions. "Mr. Holt, I didn't realize you were conducting business so early." "Mrs. Crenshaw," Barrett replied evenly. "I was just discussing supply procurement for the school." Martha's skeptical expression suggested she found the explanation as thin as Clara did, but good manners prevented her from voicing her doubts directly.
I see. Well, I came to speak with Mrs. Whitlow about a rather delicate matter. Barrett took the hint immediately. I should be going anyway. Think about what we discussed, Mrs. Whitlow. There's no need to make any permanent decisions hastily. After Barrett left, Martha settled herself on Clara's single chair with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy conversation. Mrs. Whitlow, I feel it's my duty as a Christian woman to speak plainly about a situation that's becoming the talk of the town. Clara remained standing, her hands folded at her waist. What situation would that be, Mrs. Crenshaw? Your association with Barrett Holt. Now, I'm not one to judge, and the Lord knows you're in a difficult position, but people are beginning to talk. About what, specifically? Martha shifted uncomfortably. About the nature of your relationship with Mr. Holt. A wealthy man doesn't usually take such personal interest in a widow's affairs unless he has expectations. Heat flooded Clara's cheeks, but she kept her voice level. Mr. Holt is helping to build a schoolhouse that will benefit the entire community. I fail to see how that constitutes improper behavior. It's not just the building, Mrs. Whitlow. He's been seen escorting you to his ranch for dinner, spending long hours alone with you at the school site, now visiting your private quarters at unseemly hours. Martha leaned forward conspiratorially. I'm not suggesting anything untoward has occurred, but appearances matter, especially for a woman in your position. Clara felt her temper begin to rise. My position as a teacher, or my position as a pregnant widow? Both. You're asking parents to trust you with their children's education and moral development. If they question your judgment in personal matters, the implication hung in the air between them. Clara understood the unspoken threat. Rumors about her relationship with Barrett could undermine the school before it even opened. What exactly are you suggesting I do, Mrs. Crenshaw? Be more circumspect. Limit your interactions with Mr. Holt to necessary business, conducted in public. Perhaps find a chaperone for your meetings. Martha's expression softened slightly. I know it seems unfair, but that's the reality for women in our situation. We must be above reproach. After Martha left, Clara sat on her narrow bed and pulled out the wedding ring again. The gold felt cool against her palm, substantial despite its delicate appearance. She could almost hear Thomas's voice, gentle but practical as always. Do what you must do, Clara. I'll understand. But Barrett's words echoed too. Some things are worth more than their practical value. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. This time it was Miguel, Barrett's foreman, holding his hat respectfully in his weathered hands. Senora Whitlow, Mr. Holt sent me to tell you something. He said to say that he spoke with Henderson at the general store. Made arrangements for you to have whatever supplies you need for the school, charged to his account. Clara's throat tightened. Miguel, I cannot accept. He said you would say that. He asked me to tell you this is not charity, is payment for lessons. Lessons? Miguel smiled, revealing teeth white against his sun-darkened skin. See, he wants to learn to read better. Says a man should be able to read more than cattle brands and bank drafts. You teach him. He pays for school supplies. Is business arrangement no? After Miguel left, Clara sat in the gathering dusk of her small room, turning the wedding ring in her fingers. Barrett had found a way to help her maintain her pride while solving her practical problems. He'd also given her something else, a purpose that extended beyond teaching children to helping an adult improve his life through education. The thought of teaching Barrett to read sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. She imagined sitting beside him in the evenings, watching his large, capable hands turn the pages of a book, seeing his face light up with understanding as new worlds opened to him through written words. But Martha's warnings echoed in her mind. Could she afford to ignore the gossip that such private lessons would inevitably generate? Was her growing attraction to Barrett worth risking the school's reputation? Clara slipped the wedding ring back onto her finger, where it belonged for now. She would accept Barrett's unconventional arrangement, but she would also be careful to conduct their lessons where propriety couldn't be questioned. The school was too important to risk for personal feelings, no matter how compelling those feelings were becoming. Yet as she prepared for bed that night, Clara couldn't stop thinking about Barrett's words. Some things are worth more than their practical value. Perhaps, she thought, the question wasn't whether to risk her heart, but whether she could afford not to. The town hall meeting was called for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, when most of the farmers and ranchers could spare time from their daily labors. Clara arrived early, her carefully prepared notes tucked into a leather folder Barrett had given her, along with the school charter they'd spent 3 evenings drafting by lamplight in the newly completed schoolhouse. The document represented more than legal formality. It was their shared vision made tangible, a declaration of principles that would guide the institution they were building together. Barrett stood near the back of the room when Clara entered, his presence both reassuring and troubling. She'd grown accustomed to having him beside her during challenging moments, but tonight she needed to stand on her own merit. The whispers Martha Crenshaw had warned her about had grown louder over the past 2 weeks, and Clara knew some in the community questioned whether her association with Barrett compromised her judgment. Mayor Patterson, a man whose political aspirations exceeded his actual authority, called the meeting to order with the self-importance of someone addressing a much larger gathering. "We're here tonight to discuss the proposal for a formal school in our community. Miss Whitlow has requested time to present her case." Clara rose from her seat in the front row, turning to face an audience that filled perhaps half the available chairs. She recognized most of the faces: parents who'd sent children to her makeshift classes, shopkeepers who'd observed her work with cautious interest, town leaders who viewed change with suspicion. Near the back she spotted Samuel Rodriguez and his wife Mary, their expressions hopeful but nervous. "Thank you for coming tonight," Clara began, her voice carrying clearly in the modest space. "I want to speak with you about opportunity, the kind that changes not just individual lives but entire communities." She gestured to the folder in her hands. "This charter establishes a school that will serve every child in Milfield and the surrounding area, regardless of their family's circumstances. We propose to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, and natural sciences, skills that will help your children succeed, whether they choose to remain on family farms or pursue other paths." "What other paths?" interrupted Jake Morrison, whose own education had ended when his father needed help with the family's struggling grain operation. "My boy's gonna farm like his daddy and his granddaddy. Don't need fancy book learning for that." Clara had anticipated this objection. "Mr. Morrison, can you calculate seed costs per acre? Do you know how to read market reports to get the best prices for your grain? Can you understand the contracts buyers ask you to sign?" Morrison's face reddened, but he remained silent. Clara continued gently, "I'm not suggesting your son shouldn't farm if that's his calling. I'm suggesting he should farm with every advantage education can provide." "Pretty words," said Charles Brennan, Tom's father and one of the area's more prosperous ranchers. "But who's going to pay for this grand education? We can barely afford to feed our families, let alone pay teacher salaries and buy fancy books." Barrett stepped forward before Clara could respond. "If I may address that concern, Mr. Brennan, the initial costs will be covered through private donations and partnerships. Once established, the school will operate on a sliding scale. Families pay what they can afford, whether in cash, goods, or labor." "Easy enough for you to say, Holt," Brennan replied with barely concealed resentment. "You got money to throw around on pet projects. But what happens when you lose interest? What happens to our children's education then?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Clara felt the mood of the room shift as attention focused on Barrett, waiting for his response. This was exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd hoped to avoid, questions about Barrett's motives that inevitably led to speculation about their relationship. "My interest isn't based on whim, Mr. Brennan," Barrett replied evenly. "It's based on conviction. I've seen what education can do for a community, and I've seen the cost of ignorance. This school will succeed because the people who need it most will make it succeed." Martha Crenshaw rose from her seat near the middle of the room. "Mr. Holt, we appreciate your generosity, but some of us have concerns about the arrangement between you and Mrs. Whitlow. Are you funding this school, or are you funding her?" The question Clara had dreaded landed with the force of an accusation. She felt heat rise in her cheeks as murmurs rippled through the audience. This was the moment that would define everything: her credibility, the school's future, her relationship with Barrett. "Mrs. Crenshaw," Clara said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest, "I understand your concerns about propriety. Let me address them directly." She lifted the charter document. "This school belongs to the community, not to any individual. Mr. Holt's contribution is that of a benefactor, documented legally and publicly, the same as any businessman who invests in his community's future. But is he just a benefactor?" Martha pressed. "Or are there personal considerations involved?" Clara felt the room's attention intensify, dozens of pairs of eyes watching for any sign of the romantic entanglement they suspected. She glanced toward Barrett and saw something in his expression that gave her courage, not just support, but admiration for how she was handling the confrontation. "My personal life is my own concern, Mrs. Crenshaw, but since you've raised the question publicly, I'll answer it publicly." Clara's voice grew stronger with each word. "I am a widow expecting a child, focused entirely on building something worthwhile for this community's children. Any suggestion that I would compromise that mission for personal gain underestimates both my character and my commitment." Dr. Henley, who'd remained silent until now, stood up slowly. "I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 15 years, he said in his gravelly voice. "I've seen what happens to communities that don't invest in their children's futures. They wither and die while other towns thrive." He gestured toward Clara. "This woman is offering us something precious, a chance to give our young people the tools they need to build better lives. We'd be fools to reject it because of gossip and small-minded suspicions." Samuel Rodriguez rose next, his nervousness evident but his resolve clear. My boy Jimmy been going to Mrs. Whitlow's lessons. 3 months ago he couldn't write his own name. Now he's reading stories, doing sums, asking questions about places he's never seen. That's not gossip, that's results. My Sarah's the same, added Mary Kowalski, her accent thick but her meaning clear. She comes home excited about learning, helps her little brother with letters. Is good thing this school. One by one, parents who'd sent their children to Clara's makeshift classes stood to speak. Their testimonials weren't eloquent, but they carried the weight of witness transformation. Clara felt tears threaten as she listened to their simple, powerful words about children discovering the joy of learning. When the formal testimonials ended, Mayor Patterson called for discussion. The debate that followed was sometimes heated, but generally respectful, focusing on practical concerns about funding, curriculum, and logistics. Clara answered each question with the thoroughness Barrett had helped her prepare, referencing similar schools in other frontier communities, and citing educational philosophies that emphasized practical skills alongside academic learning. As the evening wore on, Clara noticed a shift in the room's atmosphere. The initial skepticism was giving way to cautious optimism, as people began to see the school not as an impractical luxury, but as an investment in their community's future. Finally, Mayor Patterson called for a preliminary vote, not binding, but indicative of community sentiment. All in favor of supporting Mrs. Whitlow's school proposal. Clara held her breath as hands rose throughout the room. She counted quickly. Samuel Rodriguez, the Kowalskis, Dr. Henley, several other parents, even some who hadn't sent children to her classes. When the count was finished, support outnumbered opposition by nearly 2 to 1. As people began filing out of the hall, many stopped to speak with Clara. Some offered encouragement, others asked practical questions about enrollment and schedules. Barrett remained near the back, giving Clara space to accept congratulations and address concerns without the complication of his presence. Martha Crenshaw was among the last to leave. She approached Clara with an expression that mixed grudging respect with lingering suspicion. "You handled yourself well tonight, Mrs. Whitlow," she said. "I hope you'll remember that a teacher's reputation must be above reproach. The community is watching." After Martha left, Clara found herself alone with Barrett in the emptying hall. The weight of the evening's success mixed with exhaustion from the emotional strain of defending her work and character in public. "You were magnificent," Barrett said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "The way you handled Martha's accusations, the way you spoke about the school's mission. I was proud to be associated with your cause." Clara looked up at him, seeing admiration and something deeper in his dark eyes. "Our cause," she corrected softly. "This charter represents both our names, both our commitments." Barrett's gaze intensified. "Clara, about what Martha implied. She wasn't entirely wrong." Clara fought into personal considerations. "On my part, at least." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross so soon. Barrett stepped closer, close enough that Clara could see the pulse beating at his throat, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to surround him. "And on mine," he said quietly. "But Martha was wrong about one thing. Those feelings don't compromise our work, they strengthen it." Before Clara could respond, Barrett reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. "The school charter, properly filed with the territorial government. As of this afternoon, you're the officially recognized headmistress of the Milfield Community School." Clara accepted the document with trembling hands, understanding its significance beyond the legal formality. This was legitimacy, permanence, the transformation of her dream into reality. But more than that, it was Barrett's public declaration of faith in her abilities and commitment to their shared vision. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate for everything he'd given her, not just material support but belief in herself when doubt threatened to overwhelm her resolve. As they walked together through the quiet streets toward her lodgings, Clara reflected on how much had changed since her arrival in Milfield. She'd come seeking nothing more than a place to teach children, but she'd found something she hadn't expected, a partnership that was becoming the foundation for something far more significant than either of them had imagined. The school charter felt warm in her hands, a tangible reminder that dreams, properly tended and nurtured by the right people, could indeed take root and flourish even in the harshest soil. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by a railroad courier who departed as quickly as he'd come. Clara found Barrett reading it when she arrived at the schoolhouse for their usual morning review of construction progress. His face had gone ashen, and the piece of paper trembled slightly in his hands, the first time she'd ever seen his composure crack so completely. "Barrett?" She set down her lesson plans and moved closer, alarmed by his expression. "What's wrong?" He looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of shock and what might have been guilt. "It's from the Continental Railroad Company. They're offering to purchase the school property. And my ranch. for more money than I've ever seen offered for land in this territory. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Why would a railroad company want this land? Barrett passed her the letter, his movements careful and deliberate. Clara read quickly, her heart sinking with each line. The railroad proposed to establish a major depot in Millfield, complete with stockyards, grain storage facilities, and worker housing. The development would bring jobs, prosperity, and growth to the struggling community. But it would require acquiring several key properties, including the land where their school now stood. They're offering 3 times what this land is worth, Barrett said quietly. Enough to relocate the school anywhere we wanted, with money left over for supplies and teacher salaries for years to come. Clara read the letter again, searching for some detail that might change its meaning. But the terms were clear. The railroad needed this exact location due to its proximity to the river crossing and existing road networks. They weren't interested in alternative sites. "When did you know about this?" she asked, though something in Barrett's expression had already provided the answer. "I've been approached before, quietly. Representatives who mentioned the railroad's interest in expanding through this area." Barrett ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Clara had learned to recognize as a sign of deep distress. "I never took it seriously. Rail lines have been proposed through dozens of frontier towns that never saw a single track laid. But you knew. You knew when you offered to help rebuild the school that this was possible. It wasn't really a question, and Barrett didn't try to deny it. I thought it was unlikely, a remote possibility at best. The school seemed so important and you were so determined." Clara felt betrayal cut through her chest like a physical wound. "So you decided for me. Decided what I should and shouldn't know about threats to everything we were building. It wasn't like that, Clara. I genuinely believed. You believed what was convenient to believe." Clara's voice remained steady, but Barrett could hear the hurt beneath her controlled tone. "Tell me something. Is this why you offered to help? Because you knew the school might be temporary anyway?" Barrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor they'd installed just 2 weeks ago. "How can you ask me that? After everything we've shared, everything we've built together? Because I don't know what to believe anymore." Clara sank into one of the student desks, suddenly feeling the weight of her pregnancy and the exhaustion of months spent fighting for her dream. "I trusted you, Barrett, completely, and you've been keeping secrets that could destroy everything I've worked for." The silence that followed felt like a chasm opening between them. Outside, Clara could hear the sounds of normal life continuing. Children's voices from the Rodriguez farm, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the wheat fields that surrounded their small island of learning. Barrett moved to the window, staring out at the landscape they'd both grown to love. "The first time they approached me was 3 months ago, before I met you, before I knew what you were trying to do here. I told them I wasn't interested in selling. And the second time, last month, after we'd started working together, I told them the same thing, not interested." Barrett turned back to face her, his expression raw with emotion. "I should have told you then. I know that now. But I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you'd think exactly what you're thinking now. That I was using you, or that my help came with conditions you didn't know about." Barrett's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now." Clara studied his face, searching for signs of deception, but finding only pain that matched her own. "What happens if you refuse this offer?" "I don't know. They might look for other locations, or they might try to force acquisition through legal means." Barrett's honesty was brutal but necessary. Railroad companies have considerable influence with territorial governments, and if you accept...
The school would have to close. At least here, the railroad would need to begin construction immediately to meet their schedules. Clara closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what they were facing. "How long do we have?" "They want an answer within 2 weeks. Construction would begin in the spring. 2 weeks to decide the fate of everything she'd built. 2 weeks to choose between her dream and Barrett's financial security, because that's what it came down to, despite the pretty words about community development and progress. "There's something else," Barrett said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Something I found out this morning before you arrived." Clara opened her eyes, bracing herself for another blow. "I spoke with Henderson at the general store. Apparently, railroad representatives have been quietly approaching other property owners as well. Some have already agreed to sell. If enough people accept their offers, the railroad can claim eminent domain for the remaining properties, meaning they could force us to sell whether we want to or not. Possibly. The territorial government tends to favor development projects that promise economic growth." Clara stood slowly, her hand automatically going to her lower back where the baby's weight had begun to cause persistent aching. She walked to the bookshelf Barrett had built for her precious volumes, running her fingers along the spines of books that had traveled so far to find a home in this simple room. "These children," she said finally, "Jimmy Rodriguez, the Kowalski girls, Miguel's youngest. What happens to their education if we lose the school? We could rebuild somewhere else. The railroad money would." "Where, Barrett?" "This location works because it's central to the families we serve. Move it 5 miles in any direction and half our students couldn't attend regularly." Clara turned to face him, her chin set in the determined line he'd learned to both admire and fear. "And that assumes we could find families willing to trust us again after this failure." Barrett flinched at the word failure. Understanding that Clara saw the potential loss of the school as more than a setback, it was a betrayal of everyone who'd placed their faith in her vision. "There might be another way," he said carefully. "I could fight the railroad's acquisition, use my influence, my business connections, force them to find another location, and destroy your own financial future in the process." Barrett shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than casual dismissal. "Money can be rebuilt, some things can't." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Through the window, she saw Dr. Henley walking toward the school with his medical bag and the purposeful stride that usually meant someone needed his services urgently. "Mrs. Whitlow?" he called as he reached the door. "I got word you weren't feeling well this morning." Clara frowned in confusion. "I feel fine, Dr. Henley. Who told you I was ill?" The doctor's expression grew puzzled. "Martha Crenshaw stopped by my office an hour ago, said you'd sent word that you needed medical attention, said it was urgent." A cold suspicion began forming in Clara's mind. "Dr. Henley, has anyone else been asking about my health recently, about the school, or my association with Mr. Holt?" Dr. Henley's weathered face darkened with understanding. "There have been some questions, people wondering if the stress of the school project might be affecting your condition." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. "There's been talk about whether it's appropriate for a woman in your circumstances to be taking on such demanding work." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as another layer of threat revealed itself. Not only was the railroad targeting their land, but someone was questioning her fitness to continue teaching, using her pregnancy as a weapon against the school's credibility. "Who's been asking these questions, Doctor?" "Can't say for certain, but Martha Crenshaw's been very concerned about your welfare lately, and I understand some of the families are wondering if they should make other arrangements for their children's education." After Dr. Henley left, satisfied that Clara was indeed healthy, but clearly troubled by the situation he'd uncovered, Clara and Barrett stood facing each other in the schoolroom that might not be theirs much longer. "We're under attack from multiple directions," Clara said quietly. "The railroad wants our land, Martha wants to undermine my reputation, and now people are questioning whether I'm capable of continuing my work." Barrett reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather-bound book, his late wife's Bible, worn soft by years of reading and handling. Clara had seen him carry it but never known its significance until this moment. "Sarah used to read from this every night," he said, holding the book carefully. "Even when she was dying, especially then, she said it reminded her that some things endure beyond temporary troubles." He extended the Bible toward Clara. "I want you to have it, for the school library." Clara accepted the book with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of Barrett's gesture. This wasn't just a donation, it was a declaration of faith in their shared future, despite the uncertain present. "Barrett, I can't accept something so personal." "Yes, you can, because this school, what we're building here, it's not temporary. Whatever the railroad threatens, whatever Martha Crenshaw whispers, whatever challenges we face, this matters too much to let it die." Clara opened the Bible to find an inscription in faded ink. "To my beloved Sarah, may these words bring you comfort in dark times and joy in bright ones. Your devoted husband, Michael Holt." Below it, in Barrett's distinctive handwriting, was a new inscription. "To the Milfield School, may education light the way forward for generations to come." "Your father's Bible," Clara whispered, "and now it belongs to the children we're teaching." Sarah would have liked that, her words helping to shape young minds, her faith becoming part of something larger than herself. Clara pressed the Bible to her chest, feeling its weight as both comfort and responsibility. "What do we do about the railroad?" Barrett moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "We fight." Not just for the land, but for the principle that some things matter more than money. We make them understand that this community won't sacrifice its children's future for railroad profits. And if we lose, then we lose fighting for something worth preserving. But I don't think we'll lose, Clara, not if we stand together. As if summoned by his words, the sound of children's voices drifted through the open window. Students arriving for afternoon lessons, unaware that their school's existence hung in the balance. Clara watched through the window as Jimmy Rodriguez raced his sister toward the school door, both children carrying the slates Barrett had purchased for their arithmetic lessons. "They trust us," she said simply. "Yes, they do, and we won't break that trust, no matter what it costs us." Clara looked at Barrett, really looked at him, seeing not just the man who'd helped her build this school, but the partner who was willing to risk everything to preserve it. The betrayal she'd felt earlier was still there, but it was tempered now by understanding. Barrett had made mistakes, but his heart had always been in the right place. "If we're going to fight the railroad," she said, "we need to be completely honest with each other from now on. No more protective secrets, no matter how well-intentioned." Agreed, complete honesty. "And we need to prepare the community. If families are going to trust us with their children's futures, they deserve to know what threats we're facing." Barrett nodded, understanding that Clara was right. Transparency was the only way to maintain the community's faith during the battle ahead. As their students began filling the schoolroom with the cheerful chaos of learning, Clara felt her resolve strengthening. The railroad might have money and influence, but she and Barrett had something more powerful, a community of people who believed in the future they were building together, one child at a time. Barrett had spent 3 sleepless nights poring over railroad documents by lamplight, searching for some flaw in their legal claims that might give the school a fighting chance. The papers were spread across his kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal its pattern. Surveys, government correspondence, acquisition agreements, and territorial development permits. Each document appeared legitimate on its surface, but something nagged at Barrett's business instincts, a discordant note in what should have been a harmonious legal symphony. It was Clara's sudden cry of pain that shattered his concentration. The sound came from the main room where she'd been grading arithmetic papers while Barrett worked. Barrett rushed from the kitchen to find Clara doubled over in her chair, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "Clara." He knelt beside her, alarmed by the sheen of perspiration on her forehead despite the cool October evening. "What's wrong?" "The baby," she gasped, her hand pressed to her swollen belly. "Something's not right." Barrett's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Clara wasn't due for another 2 months, but he'd learned enough about frontier medicine to know that babies often followed their own schedules, especially when mothers were under stress. "I need to get you to Dr. Henley," he said, already moving to gather Clara's cloak. "Can you walk?" Another contraction seized Clara, stronger than the first, and she bit back a cry. "I don't think, Barrett. I'm scared." The admission cost her considerable pride, Barrett knew. In all the months he'd known Clara, she'd faced every challenge with unwavering determination. To hear fear in her voice shook him more than any business crisis ever had. "I'm going to carry you to the wagon," he said gently but firmly. "Hold on to me." The ride to Dr. Henley's office seemed to take hours, though Barrett knew it was less than 10 minutes. Clara gripped his arm during each contraction, her breathing becoming more labored as they traveled. Barrett found himself praying to a God he'd rarely addressed since Sarah's death, bargaining desperately for Clara and her child's safety. Dr. Henley took one look at Clara's condition and immediately ushered her into his examination room. "Boil water," he instructed Barrett curtly. "Lots of it, and find Mrs. Garcia. I'll need her help." Barrett had never felt more helpless than during the hours that followed. He paced the doctor's waiting area like a caged animal, starting at every sound from the examination room. Mrs. Garcia arrived within an hour, took one look at Barrett's haggard face, and immediately set about organizing the chaos with the efficiency of a woman who'd assisted at dozens of births. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Henley finally emerged, his sleeves rolled up and exhaustion etched into his weathered features. Barrett rose so quickly from his chair that he nearly stumbled. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Henley said immediately, understanding Barrett's desperate need for reassurance. "The baby too. False labor brought on by stress, but mother and child are both healthy." Barrett sagged with relief so profound it left him weak-kneed. "Can I see her? She's sleeping now, and she needs rest." "But yes, briefly." Clara lay propped against pillows in Dr. Henley's small recovery room, her dark hair spread across the white linens and her face peaceful in sleep. Barrett had never seen anything more beautiful or precious. He approached the bed quietly, not wanting to wake her, but Clara's eyes opened as if she'd sensed his presence. "Barrett," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the ordeal. "Is the baby fine?" "Dr. Henley says everything is fine." Barrett reached for her hand, finding it cool but steady. "How do you feel?" "Foolish, frightened, grateful." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "I thought I was going to lose everything. The baby, the school, the chance to tell you." "Tell me what?" Clara's eyes met his, and Barrett saw something in their depths that made his heart race for reasons entirely different from fear. "That I love you. That somewhere between rebuilding the barn and fighting for our school, I fell completely in love with you, and I couldn't bear the thought of dying without you knowing." Barrett felt his world shift on its axis. He'd hoped, suspected, even dared to dream, but hearing Clara speak the words aloud changed everything. "Clara, I don't say anything now," she interrupted softly. "I know it complicates everything. The school, the railroad, our partnership. I just needed you to know." Barrett leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, a promise of conversations yet to come. "Rest now. We'll talk when you're stronger." But as he prepared to leave Clara to her much-needed sleep, Mrs. Garcia appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Senor Barrett," she whispered urgently, "you need to see something. I was organizing the papers you left on the table, the railroad documents. I found something you missed." Barrett followed Mrs. Garcia to the doctor's kitchen, where she'd laid out several of the railroad surveys with the meticulous care of someone accustomed to managing complex household accounts. "Here," she said, pointing to a map dated 6 months earlier. "This survey shows the railroad's proposed route through Milfield, but look at this one." She produced a second map, dated just 2 weeks ago. The route has changed, significantly. Barrett studied the documents, his business-trained eye immediately catching the discrepancies Mrs. Garcia had identified. The original survey showed the railroad line passing well south of the school property, requiring only a small depot and minimal land acquisition, but the newer survey showed a dramatically expanded route that would encompass not just the school, but Barrett's ranch and several other prime properties. "That's not the only thing," Mrs. Garcia continued, clearly proud of her detective work. "Look at the government authorization letters." Barrett examined the territorial permits more carefully than he had during his earlier review. What he found made his blood run cold with a mixture of rage and sudden understanding. "These are forgeries," he said quietly. "The signatures don't match, the dates are inconsistent, and this seal—" He held up one document to the lamplight. "This seal is from the wrong territorial office." Mrs. Garcia nodded vigorously. "My cousin works for the territorial government in Nebraska City. I've seen enough official documents to know what they should look like. These are not right." Barrett felt pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicking into place. The railroad company isn't operating under legitimate government authority. They're running a confidence scheme, hoping to acquire properties cheaply before anyone discovers the fraud. But why change the route to include more property? Because they're not really building a railroad, Barrett realized with growing certainty. They're land speculators, buy property cheap under false pretenses, then resell it to actual railroad companies or developers at enormous profit. Mrs. Garcia's eyes widened as she understood the implications. Senora Clara's school is in no real danger from railroad development. But these criminals have been manipulating our entire community, playing on our hopes for economic growth to steal our land. Barrett gathered the documents carefully, his mind already racing through the steps needed to expose the fraud. "Mrs. Garcia, I need you to do something for me. Can you get word to Samuel Rodriguez and the other school families? Tell them I need to meet with them tonight at the schoolhouse. It's urgent." After Mrs. Garcia departed on her mission, Barrett returned to Clara's bedside. She was awake, her color much improved and her eyes alert despite her exhaustion. "You look like a man who's discovered something important," she observed. Barrett pulled a chair close to her bed and explained what Mrs. Garcia had uncovered. As he spoke, Clara's expression shifted from confusion to anger to fierce determination. "They've been lying to us from the beginning," she said when Barrett finished, "using our dreams against us to steal our property. It's worse than that. If they'd succeeded, they would have destroyed the school and displaced dozens of families for nothing more than profit." Clara struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring Barrett's protests about rest. "What do we do now? We expose them, publicly, but carefully. These people have already shown they're willing to commit fraud on a massive scale. They might be dangerous if cornered." Clara nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of their situation. "The territorial authorities need to be notified. Already planned. But first we need to warn the community and make sure no one else signs any agreements with these criminals." As Barrett prepared to leave for the emergency meeting at the school, Clara caught his hand. "Barrett, what I said earlier about loving you, that wasn't delirium from the pain." Barrett brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "I know. And when this crisis is over, when we've saved our school and sent these criminals to justice, I have something important to tell you too." The hint of a smile touched Clara's lips. "Is it something that might make Mrs. Garcia plan a wedding?" "It might be," Barrett admitted, his own smile answering hers. As Barrett rode through the darkness toward the schoolhouse where his neighbors waited for news that would change everything, he reflected on the night's revelations. He'd discovered the railroad's deception, but more importantly, he'd discovered that Clara loved him as deeply as he loved her. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had instead revealed the strength of what they'd built together. The fraudulent railroad survey map folded in his pocket represented more than evidence of criminal activity. It was proof that their school, their community, and their future together were worth fighting for with everything they had. Barrett urged his horse faster through the night, carrying with him the news that would transform fear into hope and uncertainty into action. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time since the railroad's threat had emerged, Barrett knew they were going to win. The schoolhouse had never held so many people at one time. By 8 o'clock that evening, every bench, chair, and available standing space was occupied by residents who'd responded to Mrs. Garcia's urgent summons. Word had spread quickly through the farming community that Barrett Holt had discovered something crucial about the railroad company's plans, and curiosity mixed with anxiety had drawn nearly every family in the area. Clara sat in the front row, having insisted on attending despite Dr. Henley's protests about her need for rest. Barrett stood before the assembled crowd. The fraudulent documents spread across the teacher's desk like evidence in a courtroom. The railroad survey map dominated the display, its altered routes and forged seals now clearly visible under the bright lantern light. "Neighbors," Barrett began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to addressing business meetings but tempered with the gravity of their situation. "What I'm about to tell you will anger you, and it should. We've all been victims of an elaborate fraud." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Samuel Rodriguez leaned forward, his weathered face etched with concern. "What kind of fraud, Mr. Holt?" Barrett lifted the survey map, turning it so the audience could see the discrepancies Mrs. Garcia had identified. "The Continental Railroad Company has been operating under false pretenses. These documents," he gestured to the papers on the desk, "contain forged government seals, altered surveys, and fabricated authorization letters." "You're saying there's no railroad coming to Milfield?" asked Charles Brennan, his voice mixing disappointment with skepticism. "I'm saying the people who approached us aren't representing a legitimate railroad company. They're land speculators, using fake documentation to acquire property at below-market prices." Dr. Henley rose from his seat near the back. "How can you be certain, Barrett? These documents look official to someone like me." Clara stood slowly, drawing surprised glances from those who knew she should be resting. "Mrs. Garcia has family who work for the territorial government." She recognized the inconsistencies in the paperwork, wrong seals, incorrect dates, signatures that don't match official records. "Moreover," Barrett continued, "I sent a telegraph to the actual Continental Railroad Company headquarters in Chicago this afternoon. They have no plans for expansion into this territory and no record of the representatives who've been approaching us." The room erupted in angry voices as the implications sank in. Families who'd already signed preliminary agreements realized they'd been duped. Property owners who'd been considering the railroad's offers understood they'd nearly been robbed. The promise of prosperity that had seemed too good to be true was exactly that, false hope designed to facilitate theft. Martha Crenshaw stood up, her face flushed with indignation. "If these people are criminals, why haven't the authorities been notified? Why are we sitting here talking instead of taking action?" "Because," Barrett replied calmly, "we need to be smart about how we proceed. These criminals have invested considerable time and money in their scheme. They won't abandon it easily when exposed, and they may become dangerous if they feel cornered." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady despite her recent ordeal. "Barrett contacted the Territorial Marshal's office this afternoon. Deputy Marshal Harrison will arrive tomorrow to investigate the fraud claims, but we need to coordinate our response to ensure these criminals don't escape justice." "What kind of coordination?" asked Miguel, Barrett's foreman, who'd attended with his wife and children. Barrett moved to the blackboard Clara used for lessons and began sketching a simple map of the area.
First, we need to identify everyone who's been approached by these fake railroad representatives. We need copies of any documents they've left behind, records of conversations, promises they've made. Second, Clara added, we need to prevent them from completing any more fraudulent transactions. Word needs to spread to neighboring communities that might be their next targets. Barrett nodded, marking locations on his makeshift map. Third, and most importantly, we need to ensure our own safety. These people have committed serious crimes. When they realize their scheme has been exposed, they may try to intimidate witnesses or destroy evidence. Dr. Henley raised his hand. What about the families who've already signed agreements? Are they legally bound to honor fraudulent contracts? No, Barrett replied firmly. Contracts based on fraud are void. But we need proper legal documentation to prove the fraud occurred. Samuel Rodriguez stood up, his usual nervousness replaced by determined anger. My cousin in the next county over mentioned some railroad men asking questions about land sales. I thought it was just business talk, but maybe. Exactly, Clara said. This scheme is probably larger than just Milfield. If we can help the authorities uncover the full scope of their operation, we might prevent other communities from falling victim. As the meeting progressed, Barrett found himself impressed by the community's transformation from fearful confusion to organized determination. These frontier families had survived droughts, harsh winters, and economic hardships through mutual support and collective action. Faced with a threat to their shared future, they were responding with the same unity that had built their community. Mrs. Kowalski raised her hand hesitantly. What happens to our children's school during all this trouble? Should we make other arrangements for their education? Clara exchanged a glance with Barrett before answering. The school will continue operating normally. This crisis has shown us how important it is to prepare our children for a world where they can recognize deception and defend themselves against those who would take advantage of their trust. A voice from the back called out, "What if these railroad people try to cause trouble for the school?" For Mrs. Whitlow, Barrett's expression hardened. Then they'll discover that this community protects its own. Anyone who threatens our teacher or our children will answer to all of us. The murmur of agreement that swept through the room carried the force of a promise. Clara felt tears threaten as she realized how completely these families had embraced both her and her mission. The school wasn't just her dream anymore, it belonged to the entire community. As the meeting moved into detailed planning, families volunteered for various tasks. Samuel Rodriguez and his older boys would ride to neighboring farms to spread the warning about the fraudulent railroad representatives. Dr. Henley would coordinate with the deputy marshal when he arrived. Miguel and several other men would take turns watching the roads leading into town, alert for suspicious activity. "What about the petition?" asked Mary Rodriguez, referring to the document they'd begun circulating to formalize community support for the school. Clara smiled, understanding the deeper significance of the question. "We'll continue gathering signatures, not just to support the school, but to demonstrate our unity in the face of this threat." Barrett pulled out his pocket watch, the silver timepiece that had marked so many important moments in his life. "Deputy Marshal Harrison should arrive by noon tomorrow. I suggest we meet here again tomorrow evening to coordinate with his investigation."
As the crowd began to disperse, people stopped to speak with Clara and Barrett. Some offered additional information about suspicious encounters with supposed railroad representatives. Others volunteered help with school operations if the crisis disrupted normal schedules. Several families who hadn't previously committed to sending their children to school announced their intention to enroll immediately. "Seems like this fraud attempt has actually strengthened support for the school," Dr. Henley observed wryly as he prepared to escort Clara back to his office for the night. "Crisis often reveals what truly matters to people," Clara replied. "Our neighbors aren't just protecting their property, they're protecting their vision of what this community can become." After the others had departed, Barrett and Clara found themselves alone in the schoolhouse, where they'd spent so many hours planning and dreaming. The room still held the warmth of human presence, but now it also held something else, the weight of shared purpose and mutual trust that had been forged in the face of adversity. "Are you sure you're feeling well enough for all this?" Barrett asked, studying Clara's face for signs of the strain he knew she must be experiencing. "I'm fine, more than fine actually. For the first time since arriving in Milfield, I feel like we're not just building a school, we're building a real community." Clara moved to the window that looked out over the land they'd fought so hard to protect. Barrett, about what I said earlier, when I thought I might lose the baby, I meant what I said about having something important to tell you, Barrett interrupted gently. But first, let's see this crisis through together. There'll be time for everything else once we've secured our future. Clara nodded, understanding that Barrett wanted to face her as a man who'd helped protect their community, not one still dealing with the chaos of criminal threats. It was another sign of the careful consideration he brought to everything that mattered to him. The petition, Clara said suddenly. We need to make sure every family in the area has a chance to sign it before the deputy marshal arrives. It needs to show overwhelming community support for the school. Already thought of that. Miguel's wife is an excellent organizer. She's coordinating with the other women to ensure everyone who wants to sign gets the opportunity. Clara smiled at Barrett's foresight. You really have thought of everything, not everything, but I'm learning that the most important battles aren't won by individuals, they're won by communities working together toward a common goal. As they prepared to lock up the schoolhouse for the night, Clara paused at her desk to straighten the papers that would begin tomorrow's lessons. The simple arithmetic problems and reading exercises seemed precious now, symbols of normalcy and hope in the face of uncertainty. Whatever happens with the deputy marshal's investigation, she said quietly, this school will survive. We've proven that tonight. Barrett moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth and strength. We've proven more than that. We've proven that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The community petition lay on Clara's desk, already bearing dozens of signatures from families who'd committed their children's future to her care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they worked with law enforcement to bring the criminals to justice. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of their shared dream, Barrett and Clara stood together, knowing they'd built something that no amount of fraud or deception could destroy. The school bell Barrett had commissioned gleamed softly in the lantern light, ready to call students to learning and community to action. Whatever tomorrow brought, it would ring with the voice of a people united in purpose and unshakable in their faith that education, honesty and love could triumph over greed and deception. Deputy Marshal Tom Harrison arrived in Milfield at precisely 11:30 the next morning, riding a dust-covered horse and carrying the weather-beaten appearance of a man who'd spent the better part of 2 decades bringing law to lawless territories. Barrett met him at the edge of town, having watched for his approach from the schoolhouse, where he'd been reviewing the evidence one final time with Clara. Mr. Holt, the marshal said, dismounting with the careful movements of someone whose joints had absorbed too many hard miles. Got your telegram about railroad fraud. That's a serious accusation, serious situation, Marshal Harrison. We have documents, witnesses, and what we believe is evidence of a coordinated scheme to defraud multiple communities. Barrett gestured toward the schoolhouse. Mrs. Whitlow has been helping organize the evidence. She's the school teacher these criminals have been trying to displace. Harrison's grey eyes took in the neat building with its fresh timber and carefully tended grounds. Seems like a poor target for criminals. What's so valuable about a country schoolhouse? It's not about the school specifically. It's about the land underneath it and the community's faith in progress and development. Barrett began walking toward the building, Harrison falling into step beside him. These people presented themselves as advanced scouts for a major railroad expansion. They offered to purchase properties at premium prices, claiming urgent need for depot construction. But there's no railroad expansion, none whatsoever. We've confirmed that with the actual Continental Railroad Company. These criminals were planning to acquire valuable land cheaply, then disappear before anyone discovered the fraud. Inside the schoolhouse, Clara sat at her desk organizing the evidence they'd gathered over the past 24 hours. She rose as Barrett and the marshal entered, extending her hand with the confident grace Barrett had learned to admire. Marshal Harrison, thank you for coming so quickly. I'm Clara Whitlow. Harrison touched his hat brim respectfully. Ma'am, Mr. Holt tells me you've been targeted by these supposed railroad representatives. They tried to purchase the land under our school, yes, but their scheme extends far beyond our property. Clara moved to the blackboard where she'd mapped out the extent of the criminals' activities. We've identified at least 12 families who've been approached, 3 neighboring communities where similar offers have been made, and evidence suggesting this operation has been active for several months. The marshal studied Clara's careful documentation with the appreciation of someone who'd seen too many investigations hampered by poor record-keeping. You've been thorough, Mrs. Whitlow. Mrs. Garcia deserves the credit for discovering the forged documents. Her familiarity with territorial government paperwork revealed the inconsistencies. Clara handed Harrison the survey maps that had started their investigation. These surveys show route changes that make no engineering sense, government seals from the wrong offices, and signatures that don't match official records. Harrison examined the documents carefully, his weathered face growing increasingly grim. These are definitely forgeries, professional quality, but forgeries nonetheless. He looked up at Barrett. How much money are we talking about? How many people have been victimized? Based on the property values involved, easily $50,000 in fraudulent transactions if they'd succeeded, Barrett replied. Fortunately, most families were waiting for official confirmation before finalizing sales. Most families? Clara's expression darkened. The Hendersons at the general store signed a preliminary agreement 3 days ago. They were promised payment this afternoon. Harrison stood abruptly. Then we need to move quickly. If these criminals are planning to complete transactions today, they're probably preparing to leave town immediately afterward. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window. A small group of riders was approaching the school. 4 men Barrett didn't recognize, dressed in the kind of expensive traveling clothes that marked them as outsiders in this farming community. Those would be our railroad representatives, Barrett said quietly, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he'd brought from his ranch. Marshal Harrison moved to the window for a better view. Bold of them to approach openly, unless they don't know their scheme has been discovered. Clara joined them at the window, studying the approaching riders with sharp attention. The man in the lead coat, that's the one who approached me initially about purchasing the school property. He called himself William Cross, claimed to be a surveyor for the railroad company. Well, Mr. Cross is about to have a very interesting conversation with a territorial marshal, Harrison said grimly. He turned to Barrett and Clara. I want you both to stay inside while I handle this initial contact. If they suspect they've been exposed, they might try to run, and I need witnesses who can testify about their activities. The 4 men dismounted near the school entrance, their leader, the supposed William Cross, approaching the door with the confident stride of someone who believed his deception was still intact. Harrison positioned himself just inside the entrance, badge visible, but weapon holstered, projecting authority without immediate threat. Cross knocked firmly and entered without waiting for permission, stopping short when he saw the marshal's badge. Gentlemen, I wasn't expecting to find law enforcement at our meeting location. Mr. Cross, I presume? Harrison's voice carried the flat tone of a man who'd arrested too many criminals to be impressed by their performances. I'm Deputy Marshal Harrison. I understand you've been conducting business in this area. Cross recovered quickly, his smile never wavering. Indeed. Continental Railroad Company Advance Acquisitions. We're preparing for a major expansion through this territory. He gestured toward Barrett. Mr. Holt, I trust you've had time to consider our generous offer. Barrett stepped forward, his own expression carefully neutral. I've considered it very carefully, Mr. Cross. In fact, I've been in communication with the Continental Railroad Company headquarters about your proposal. Something flickered in Cross's eyes, the first crack in his confident facade. Oh. And what did they tell you? That they have no record of you, no plans for expansion in this territory, and no authority for anyone to make property acquisitions on their behalf. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Cross's 3 companions shifted nervously, clearly recognizing that their situation had changed dramatically. But Cross himself maintained his composure with the skill of an experienced confidence man. There must be some misunderstanding, he said smoothly. Large corporations often have communication delays between departments. I'm sure if you contacted the proper division. Mr. Cross, Marshal Harrison interrupted, stepping forward with a set of shackles clearly visible on his belt. You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft. Cross's mask finally slipped. You can't prove anything. Those documents are legitimate, and if there's been some mix-up with corporate communications. Clara stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Mr. Cross, we have the forged survey maps you provided, witnesses to your fraudulent claims, and confirmation from the actual Continental Railroad Company that you're operating without authorization. The evidence is overwhelming. One of Cross's companions, a nervous young man who'd clearly not expected their scheme to face serious investigation, broke under the pressure. William, maybe we should shut up, Peters, Cross snapped, his gentleman's facade dissolving completely. These country fools can't prove anything that will hold up in territorial court. Barrett felt anger rise in his chest at the casual contempt in Cross's voice. These criminals had seen the community's hopes for progress as nothing more than vulnerabilities to exploit, treating honest families like marks in an elaborate confidence game. Actually, Barrett said quietly, producing the property deed he'd been carrying, we can prove quite a lot, including the fact that you've been operating this scheme in multiple communities, defrauding families who trusted your promises of legitimate business. Cross's eyes fixed on the deed with sudden sharp interest. Mr. Holt, perhaps we could discuss this situation privately. I'm authorized to make very generous arrangements for property owners who prove cooperative. The only arrangement I'm interested in, Barrett replied, is seeing you and your associates face justice for the crimes you've committed. Marshal Harrison moved closer to Cross, hand resting on his weapon. Mr. Cross, you have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can be used against you in territorial court, your associates as well. As Harrison began arresting the four criminals, Clara moved to Barrett's side. The property deed in his hands represented more than legal documentation. It was proof of his absolute commitment to their shared future, his willingness to risk everything to protect what they'd built together. You were prepared to sign over your ranch, she said quietly, understanding the magnitude of what Barrett had been willing to sacrifice. Some things matter more than property ownership, Barrett replied, watching as the criminals were secured with professional efficiency. Our school, our community, our future together, those are worth any risk. Through the window, Clara could see neighbors beginning to gather as word spread that the criminals had been apprehended. Samuel Rodriguez arrived with his sons, followed by Dr. Henley and several other families who'd been victimized by the fraud scheme. Mrs. Whitlow, Marshal Harrison called. I'll need detailed statements from you and Mr. Holt about your interactions with these criminals. Also, any documentation you've gathered about their activities in other communities. As Clara began organizing the evidence for Harrison's investigation, she reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. 24 hours ago, she'd feared losing everything: the school, Barrett's support, her dreams for the community's children. Now, standing in the schoolroom surrounded by proof of the community's unity and Barrett's unwavering commitment, she understood that some victories were worth any struggle required to achieve them. The criminals who'd threatened their future were now facing justice, but more importantly, the crisis had revealed the true strength of what she and Barrett had built together. The school wasn't just a building anymore. It was the heart of a community that would protect its own against any threat. The territorial courtroom in Nebraska City had never seen a case quite like the one that unfolded over 3 days in late October. Judge Samuel Morrison, a stern man who'd spent 15 years bringing order to frontier justice, presided over proceedings that drew spectators from across the territory. Word had spread quickly about the elaborate fraud scheme that had targeted multiple communities, and the courtroom galleries filled with curious onlookers and potential victims eager to see justice served. Clara sat in the front row of the witness section, her hands folded over the gentle swell of her pregnancy, watching as Prosecutor James Whitman methodically presented the evidence she and Barrett had helped gather. The forged documents were displayed on easels for the jury to examine, their fraudulent seals and altered signatures clearly visible under the courtroom's harsh lighting. Barrett testified first, his voice steady and businesslike as he described the criminals' initial approach and the subsequent discovery of their deception. The property deed he'd been prepared to sacrifice lay on the prosecutor's table, evidence of both the criminals' ambitions and Barrett's commitment to protecting his community. Mr. Holt, Prosecutor Whitman asked, why did you become suspicious of the defendant's claims? Several factors, sir. The route changes between survey maps made no engineering sense. The timelines were impossibly compressed for a project of the stated scope. Most importantly, the defendants showed no interest in legitimate railroad concerns like water rights, grade calculations, or existing transportation contracts. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Bradley who'd clearly been hired with money from previous fraudulent schemes, tried to undermine Barrett's testimony by questioning his expertise in railroad construction. Mr. Holt, are you a qualified engineer? Do you have professional experience in railroad development? No, sir, but I do have 15 years of experience in frontier business dealings, and I know the difference between legitimate documentation and forgery. When Clara took the witness stand, she carried with her the school charter that had formalized their educational mission. Judge Morrison allowed her to explain how the defendant's scheme had threatened not just property owners, but the entire community's investment in their children's future. Mrs. Whitlow, Prosecutor Whitman asked, please describe the defendant Cross's approach to acquiring your school property. Clara's voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom as she recounted Cross's promises and deceptions. He presented the acquisition as inevitable, claimed the territorial government had already approved the route and that resistance would be futile. He used our community's hopes for economic development as a weapon against us. And what convinced you that his claims were false? Clara gestured toward the evidence table where Mrs. Garcia's careful documentation was displayed. Mrs. Garcia's careful documentation was displayed. Mrs. Garcia's careful documentation was displayed. Garcia, who has family working in territorial government, recognized that the seals and signatures were incorrect. More importantly, Mr. Holt's telegraph to the actual Continental Railroad Company confirmed that no expansion was planned. The defense attorney attempted to portray Clara as an emotional woman whose pregnancy had affected her judgment, but Clara's calm, precise answers and careful documentation made his arguments appear foolish rather than persuasive. The proceedings' most dramatic moment came when Peters, the nervous young man who'd accompanied Cross, broke down under cross-examination and confessed to the scheme's full scope. Through tears and stammering admissions, he revealed a network of fraudulent land acquisitions spanning 3 territories, targeting communities hungry for economic development. "How many communities did your group target?" Prosecutor Whitman asked. Maybe 20, Peters sobbed. "Small towns, farming communities, places where people wanted to believe in progress. We figured they'd be easy marks." The gallery erupted in angry murmurs at Peters's casual description of their victims as marks. Judge Morrison gave for order, but Clara could see fury in the faces of spectators who understood how close their own communities had come to victimization. Cross himself proved to be an unrepentant witness, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence and even attempting to justify his actions as legitimate business practices. His arrogance only strengthened the prosecution's case, demonstrating the calculated nature of his crimes. On the trial's final day, both sides presented closing arguments. The defense attorney made a desperate attempt to portray the defendants as misguided businessmen whose paperwork errors didn't constitute intentional fraud. But Prosecutor Whitman's closing was devastating in its clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Whitman said, gesturing toward the evidence that covered 3 tables, "the defendants didn't make paperwork errors. They committed deliberate, systematic fraud designed to steal the life savings of honest frontier families. They forged government documents, impersonated Federal Railroad representatives, and used communities' hopes for progress as tools of deception." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the silent courtroom. "Mrs. Whitlow and Mr. Holt represent something the defendants cannot understand. People who build rather than steal, who invest in their community's future rather than exploiting its trust. The defendants saw opportunity in others' dreams. The victims saw opportunity in their children's education." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Morrison sentenced Cross to 5 years in territorial prison, with his accomplices receiving sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years. More importantly, the judge ordered full restitution to be paid from the criminals' assets, which had been seized during their arrest. As the courtroom emptied, Clara and Barrett found themselves surrounded by grateful families from communities across the territory. Many had traveled significant distances to witness the proceedings, understanding that the verdict would determine whether similar schemes could target their own towns in the future. "Mrs. Whitlow," said a woman from a community 50 miles north of Milfield, "we heard about your school, about how you fought to protect it. We're hoping to start something similar in our area." Clara felt tears threaten at the realization that their struggle had inspired others to pursue education for their own children. "I'd be happy to share what we've learned," she replied. "Building a school is challenging work, but the rewards are immeasurable." Barrett stood beside her, his hand gently touching her elbow in support and shared pride. The gavel that had pronounced justice lay on Judge Morrison's bench, a symbol of truth prevailing over deception, community strength triumphing over individual greed. Outside the courthouse, Samuel Rodriguez approached Barrett with the community petition they'd circulated during the crisis. "Mr. Holt, we wanted you to see this. Every family in the area signed it, plus families from 3 neighboring communities who heard about what happened." Barrett accepted the document, scanning the dozens of signatures that represented unwavering support for Clara's educational mission. "This belongs to Mrs. Whitlow," he said, handing the petition to Clara. "She's the one who earned this community's trust." Clara looked at the names covering multiple pages, some written in careful script, others in the uncertain hand of people for whom writing remained difficult. Each signature represented a family's faith in education's power to improve their children's lives. "We earned it together," she corrected gently. "This petition represents more than support for a school. It represents a community that discovered its own strength." Henley joined their group, his weathered face showing satisfaction at the day's outcome. "Well, Mrs. Whitlow, I believe you can stop worrying about the school's future. After today's testimony, I suspect you'll have more enrollment requests than you can handle." Clara laughed, the sound bright with relief and anticipation. "Dr. Henley, I can't think of a better problem to have." As they prepared for the journey back to Milfield, Barrett drew Clara aside for a private conversation. The courthouse steps bustled with activity as other visitors departed, but Barrett and Clara found a quiet corner where they could speak without interruption. "Clara," Barrett began, his voice carrying a formality that seemed oddly out of place after everything they'd shared. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you, something I couldn't ask while our future remained uncertain." Clara's heart began racing as Barrett reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. The afternoon sunlight caught the simple gold band inside, not ornate or expensive, but solid and enduring like the man offering it. "I know you've already built a remarkable life for yourself," Barrett continued, his usual confidence tempered by vulnerability. "You don't need my help or my protection, but I'm hoping you might want my partnership in more than just the school." Clara looked at the ring, then at Barrett's face, seeing hope and love and commitment in his dark eyes. "Barrett, are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'll marry me, Clara, if you'll let me stand beside you as we build not just a school, but a family and a life together." The gavel of justice from Judge Morrison's courtroom had pronounced legal victory, but Barrett's proposal represented something far more precious, the promise of personal happiness built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and love that had grown stronger through every challenge they'd faced. Clara reached for the ring with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from the overwhelming joy of seeing her deepest hopes realized. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Barrett, I can't imagine building the future with anyone else." As Barrett slipped the ring onto her finger, next to the wedding band from her first marriage that she'd chosen to keep as a reminder of love's enduring nature, Clara understood that some victories were worth any struggle required to achieve them. They'd saved their school, brought criminals to justice, and discovered that their partnership was strong enough to withstand any test. The territorial courthouse behind them represented the law's power to protect honest people from those who would exploit their trust. But the ring on Clara's finger represented something even more powerful, the promise that love, properly nurtured and protected, could indeed flourish in even the harshest circumstances. 6 months later, on a warm April morning when the Nebraska prairie had dressed itself in the tender green of new grass and wildflowers, Clara stood at the window of the completed schoolhouse, watching her students work in the garden they'd planted together. The foundation stone that Barrett had commissioned lay embedded in the school's front wall, its engraved words, "Built on Hope, 1887, catching the morning sunlight like a promise fulfilled." Her daughter Mary, named for the Virgin who'd watched over difficult births and new beginnings, slept peacefully in the cradle Barrett had crafted during the long winter evenings. At 3 months old, Mary had already become the unofficial school mascot, her presence a daily reminder that education was ultimately about nurturing the future, one child at a time. "Mrs. Holt," came Jimmy Rodriguez's voice from the garden, "the tomato seedlings you brought from your greenhouse are growing real good." Clara smiled at the name that still felt new and wonderful 6 months after their wedding. She and Barrett had married in the schoolhouse itself, with the entire community in attendance and Dr. Henley performing the ceremony. It had seemed fitting to begin their life together in the place where their partnership had first taken root. "That's excellent, Jimmy," Clara called back through the open window. "Remember what we discussed about proper spacing?" "Yes, ma'am. Give each plant room to grow, just like giving each student room to learn at their own pace." Clara's heart swelled with pride at Jimmy's understanding. At 10 years old, he was reading at a level that would have impressed teachers in established Eastern schools, and his aptitude for mathematics suggested a future that might include engineering or business, if that was his choice. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Clara's attention to the road where Barrett was returning from his morning inspection of the cattle. At 8 months pregnant when they'd married, Clara had worried about the adjustments required to blend their lives, but Barrett had proven to be a natural father whose patience with Mary was matched only by his respect for Clara's continued commitment to teaching. Barrett entered the schoolhouse carrying a leather satchel and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose morning's work had gone well. "Good morning, wife," he said, the words still carrying traces of wonder even after 6 months of marriage. "Good morning, husband," Clara replied, moving into his arms for the brief embrace that had become their daily greeting. "How are the cattle?" "Thriving. Miguel thinks we'll have our best calving season yet." Barrett glanced toward the cradle where Mary stirred slightly but didn't wake. "How's our daughter this morning?" "Perfect, like her father claims she is every day." Clara laughed softly, still marveling at Barrett's complete devotion to the child who wasn't biologically his but whom he loved with fierce protectiveness. Barrett moved to his desk. He'd taken over managing the school's business affairs and correspondence with other frontier educators and began sorting through the morning's mail. Their school had gained attention throughout the territory following the railroad fraud trial, and Clara regularly received letters from teachers in other communities seeking advice about establishing their own schools. "Interesting letter here," Barrett said, holding up an official-looking envelope. "From the Territorial Education Department." Clara paused in her preparation of the day's geography lesson. "What do they want?" Barrett opened the letter and read quickly, his expression shifting from curiosity to amazement. "They're offering you a position as Regional Education Supervisor. You'd be responsible for helping establish schools throughout the territory, with a salary that's more than most university professors earn." Clara felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What would that involve? Travel to communities throughout Nebraska and parts of Kansas and Colorado. Consultation on curriculum development, teacher training, and school administration. Barrett looked up from the letter with eyes that held both pride and concern. "It's an incredible opportunity, Clara. Recognition of everything you've accomplished here." Clara moved to the window again, looking out at her students who were now helping each other measure plant spacing with rulers they'd made in arithmetic class. Sarah Kowalski was patiently explaining fractions to her younger brother, while Miguel's daughter Elena carefully recorded their measurements in the journal she'd started keeping about the garden's progress. "It's an honor to be considered," Clara said slowly, "but my place is here, with these children and this community." Barrett stood and moved to join her at the window. "Is it? Or have you outgrown what Milfield can offer? You've proven that education can transform rural communities. Maybe it's time to share that knowledge more widely." Clara considered his words, understanding the deeper question he was asking. Had her success here prepared her for greater challenges, or had it simply confirmed that building one excellent school was achievement enough for any educator? "What do you think I should do?" she asked, valuing Barrett's perspective more than any official recommendation. "I think," Barrett said carefully, "that you should do whatever feels right for the next stage of your journey. If that means expanding your influence to help more communities, I'll support that decision completely. Even if it means leaving Milfield, leaving you and Mary for extended periods." Barrett was quiet for a long moment, watching their students work with the focused attention that characterized everything he considered important. "Clara, when I first saw you reading to those children by lamplight, I knew I was witnessing something special. Not just a teacher doing her job, but someone called to transform lives through education." He turned to face her fully. "I married you because I love you, but also because I believe in your mission. If that mission now requires a larger stage, then that's what we'll make work." Before Clara could respond, the sound of childish laughter drew their attention back to the garden where the children had discovered something that required adult investigation. Clara and Barrett walked outside together, Mary's cradle carried carefully between them. "Mrs. Holt," called Elena, Miguel's daughter, "come see what we found." The children had uncovered a small family of rabbits that had taken up residence among the vegetable plantings. The mother rabbit and her babies showed no fear of the children, apparently understanding that this was a place where young things were nurtured and protected. "Look how the mama rabbit is teaching her babies to find food," observed 10-year-old Thomas Brennan, whose father had initially opposed the school but now spoke proudly of his son's academic progress. "Just like you teach us to find answers in books." Clara felt tears threaten at the innocent wisdom in Thomas's observation. Education was indeed about teaching young minds to find nourishment where it existed, to recognize opportunity and understand how to grasp it. "That's a beautiful comparison, Thomas," she said. "What else do you notice about how the mother rabbit cares for her family?" "She stays close to them," said Sarah Kowalski, "but she lets them explore on their own too." Barrett squeezed Clara's hand gently, understanding that the children's observations were providing unexpected insight into the decision she faced. Good teachers, like good parents, provided security while encouraging independence. They prepared their students for futures that might require leaving familiar places in pursuit of growth and opportunity. That evening, after the children had departed for their homes and Mary had been settled for the night, Clara and Barrett sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the prairie that had become their shared landscape of dreams realized. "I've been thinking about the territorial education position," Clara said quietly, "and I've been thinking about legacy, what kind of mark we leave on the world." Clara gestured toward the schoolhouse visible in the distance, its bell tower silhouetted against the evening sky. "This school will continue long after we're gone. The children we've taught will become parents themselves, passing on not just knowledge but love of learning to their own children." Barrett nodded, understanding that Clara was working toward a decision that felt right for both her personal convictions and their shared future. "But there are other communities, other children who deserve the same opportunities we've created here," Clara continued. "Maybe the way to honor what we've built is to help others build something similar. So you'll accept the position?" Clara turned to face Barrett, seeing love and support in his expression despite the personal cost her decision would require. "I'll accept it on certain conditions. I want to continue teaching here part-time, maintaining my connection to our school and our students. And I want you and Mary to travel with me when possible, so our family remains together." Barrett's smile was answer enough, but he provided words as well. "Mrs. Holt, I can't think of a better way to spend the next chapter of our lives than helping you transform education throughout the frontier." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd arrived in Milfield as a pregnant widow with nothing but books and determination. She was leaving, though only partially, as a wife, mother, and educator whose influence would extend far beyond the borders of any single community. The foundation stone embedded in their school's wall would remain as a permanent reminder that hope, properly nurtured and protected, could indeed flourish even in the harshest circumstances. But Clara understood now that the most important foundations weren't made of stone. They were made of love, commitment, and the unwavering belief that education could transform not just individual lives, but entire societies. The schoolhouse bell caught the last rays of sunlight, ready to ring tomorrow with the voice of a community that had learned the difference between false promises and genuine opportunity. And in communities throughout the territory, other bells would soon be ringing as Clara helped more families discover that the greatest investment they could make was in their children's minds and dreams. Some stories end with victory over external threats. But the best stories end with the understanding that victory is only meaningful when it becomes the foundation for even greater achievements. Clara and Barrett had saved their school, but more importantly, they discovered that some partnerships are strong enough to change the world, one child and one community at a time.